Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video where I'm going to be teaching you guys everything a beginner needs to know if they're trying to learn the Remix framework. I'm going to be going over the basics of Remix by explaining things ranging from just the basics like folder structure, routing, and so on, to also explaining to you guys the difference between server and client components and how to build an application using all of those things together. I really do believe that by the end of this video, you'll have a pretty good grasp on how to use Remix to build your applications and understand where it gets its benefits and negatives and why you would want to even use Remix in the future. If you're interested in just getting the code, that's totally fine as well. The code will be in the description, but I do recommend watching the tutorial because I really like this tutorial, and I think the example I'm going to be using is the one that I used to learn Remix when I got started with learning it. So with that in mind, before we get into the video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. It would help push my videos to more people, and I would be really grateful if you could do so. So let's get into the video. Before we get into this video, I want to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, brilliant.org. If you're going to build web applications by using a framework like Remix that we're going to be learning in this video, you'll find that it will require you to have some problem-solving skills and an understanding of the core computer science and programming concepts. And in that case, I believe today's sponsor, Brilliant.org, can really help you. Brilliant is an interactive learning platform where they have thousands of lessons on programming, computer science, and data analysis. It is perfect for anyone, ranging from someone who is just a beginner looking to learn a new topic to someone who just wants to reinforce and sharpen their skills. If you particularly like my style of teaching, I think you will really enjoy learning at Brilliant because of their hands-on approach, where you're getting exercises to constantly reinforce your learning while you're going through the lessons. I particularly enjoy their algorithm and data structures course because I think even if you're just a front-end developer, you'll probably need to learn algorithms and data structures at some point. Not only their course helps you understand core concepts that every programmer needs to know, but it can also help you with your tech interviews because you obviously know they require algorithms and data structures. With bite-sized lessons that you can basically tackle any time of the day, you'll be able to make significant progress by doing any of their courses, and I highly recommend them. Now, Brilliant has been a sponsor of the channel for a while now, and I've heard from my own subscribers that they actually enjoyed their lessons. So if you want to check them out, just go to the link in the description or just go to brilliant.org/PedroTech. One great thing about Brilliant is that they're constantly having deals. So right now it is completely free for 30 days if you guys want to check it out. And also, if you guys are interested in purchasing the annual premium subscription, all of my subscribers will have 20% off by using the link in the description, or like I said, just going to brilliant.org/PedroTech. Again, thank you so much, Brilliant, for sponsoring this video, and let's get into the tutorial. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. I want to start off this tutorial by just giving you a very brief explanation about what Remix really is and why it is used. Well, to start off, Remix is a modern web framework that focused on optimizing user experience by combining server-side rendering and client-side routing. In a way, it is really similar to something like Next.js, and it emphasizes specifically on seamless transitions, fast data fetching, and progressive enhancements by using various different web standards. Similar to Next.js in this sense, it allows you to create a full-stack application by having a part of your app where it's dealing with the routing, another part which is dealing with fetching and loading data, and another part which is dealing with having actions and mutations by basically leveraging the idea of React client components and server components. Now, if all of that sounds confusing at start, don't worry, because we're going to go in a very beginner way through each of those topics, while also building an application that, despite being very beginner based, will also give you guys an insight on all the different things that I think are important in order to learn Remix. So the first thing we want to do is run a command that is going to generate all of the boilerplate code for our Remix application. So the command in this case is the create remix command. And we're also going to do an @latest so that we can get the latest version of the Remix package. So you guys are up to date. I'm using the version 2.4, I believe. And by the way, I'm also creating all of this inside of this already pre-made folder, so do so as well. Okay, I'm going to press enter, and it's going to start asking me a couple questions. First of all, it needs to install the create remix version, which as you can see is at 2.14, not 2.4. going to press enter and it's going to start installing everything for me. But when it's done, it's going to ask me where I should create that project. You can create a specific folder over here if you want to put your project there. I just want to create it inside of the folder that I'm already in. So I'll just press dot. Then it will ask me, okay, initialize new Git repository. Yes, I do want one because I'm going to upload this to GitHub. Install the dependencies. Yes. So I'll press enter again. And it should start installing all the packages, and the files seems to already be laid out over here. Okay, as you can see, we finished it off. We can also run the application. If you go to the package.json, you'll see that there's a couple scripts. The specific script that we want to run is the dev script. So we're going to run npm run dev. And as you can see, it should create a local server on our localhost 5173. And if we go to our browser on this specific route, you should see that we have indeed a Remix application running. And it gives us this very boilerplate thing that all of the packages and frameworks have. But we're going to obviously go through the folder structure first, because so you guys understand a little bit of how this project is set up. So first things first, we have here a ts config and a tailwind.config.ts, which should imply to you that Remix application is using Tailwind and TypeScript. Now you can indeed build Remix applications without Tailwind and TypeScript, but I am following what I believe is the standard for most of the web right now. I've talked about this in the past. TypeScript, I believe you should use in every application, and Tailwind is a great CSS framework. And this already comes in with the boilerplate command for creating a Remix application. So it's what Remix recommends us using. And if you're not familiar with those, I do have videos on either of them, but they aren't that important to understand for following this tutorial. So if you just want to focus on Remix, it won't be a problem, especially because I won't be writing the Tailwind myself. I'll just paste the Tailwind at the end of the video so we can get a minor UI change, so we don't waste time with that and only focus on the Remix itself. So now let's go over the folder structure. As you can see, we have two folders that we should really care about, and one more than the other. We have the app folder and the public folder. The public folder is pretty similar in almost all of the different frameworks. It's basically a place where you can just store different icons, images, and fonts, or whatever public assets that you want to store, and that can actually be served as it is through the URL of your application. So we won't be dealing with this specifically because the important one is the app folder over here. And you can see that inside of it, it already has a couple standards that it requires us to follow. First things first, we have the tailwind.css. This is the Tailwind file that we're going to be running in our application. Obviously, Tailwind, you write directly onto the class name of the items, but we can also apply general styles by using something like the CSS file. Then we also have the root.tsx. This is the root layout component for the entire application. It contains different information, as you can see over here, and I can explain each of them. First, as you can see, we have the imports that obviously are important to run in this file. Then we have the links function, which is basically used to dynamically inject any links tag into our head part of our HTML. So it's typically used for when you want to pre-connect style sheets and also injecting fonts, as you can see over here. Now, we won't worry that much about this, but if you're running, for example, any type of CSS, you can actually add the link to the style sheet directly over here. Then we have this layout function, which generates the basis of our HTML page. Now, the reason why this is very prevalent in Remix, and you might not see it using something like just normal React with Create React App or something like that, or even just using Vite in itself, is that we're focusing a lot on the tags and on the metadata so that we want to improve our SEO in our website. And you can see we can add all of that kind of information over here, but there's also a meta component that whenever we want to declare metadata, we can actually link to it. All of this you shouldn't change, you shouldn't actually move at all. Then we also have the scripts, which basically will inject any necessary scripts for Remix to enable client-side interactivity. Again, don't worry about this at all. I'm just going over each of them so that you at least get an idea of them. Then we also have scroll restoration, which I believe this one, I never touched it, and I don't really care about it. I don't think it's ever mattered to me, but I believe it basically helps to maintain like your scroll position, so where you are scrolling whenever you're moving between routes. That's kind of what I understood from it. And then we have obviously the app function over here returning an outlet. Now when we run our app, this is where it's gonna basically export, right, where it's gonna live. If I wanted to just run an app with an h1 tag saying hey, I could replace that, and you will see that this is what our app became. But outlet over here is basically a placeholder component representing that is rendering the current route's content. So if we move the route, depending on which route we're going to be in, this outlet is going to represent a different thing, a different component. And we're going to handle that because all the routes will exist inside of this folder over here, but we're going to get there in a second. So this is the root.tsx component. Now let's talk about just these two files over here, which in itself, especially if you're a beginner, I don't think you should worry that much about them. The entry.server.tsx and the entry.client.tsx are by default entry points for both the client and the server rendering process. So like I said, there are Remix allows you to work both on the front end, so on the client, and also on the server, which is amazing. And we're going to simulate that with the project in the end of the video. But as you can see, if you want to change this, you're free to delete this file and do whatever you want. But by default, Remix is already handle hydrating in our app for us. So this is amazing. I don't touch this unless necessary, and I don't think you should as well. Now, this was a lot of not touching and me just going over things that I think are important to mention, but not important to actually care about, at least as a beginner. Now we're getting into the part where you should care about, which is handling routes. Like I said, we have over here our initial app, which is just a single component that was already created, and it exists inside of this index.tsx file. Now, all of the routes that you want to have in your application are going to exist as files inside of this routes folder. Now, it's the main file, the initial route, has to be named like this, you know, index.tsx, and you can see this is how it is created. As you can see, it came already with a bunch of stuff, which we will delete. But before we delete, I think it's important to understand what each of these things are. First things first, like I said, you can export a meta function in each of your components or pages, which will represent, and it's in this format over here, it represents the different metadata information you want for this page. So it's good because, again, it helps with SEO. You can specifically write a title, a name, a content, anything metadata related, you can put as this export function over here, where you literally export it within a meta, and you need to make sure it's called meta. Then we have the index component that we are exporting. So you might have noticed that we are exporting every function, right? Because Remix, not this one specifically, but those two functions. Remix requires that you export functions with specific purposes. Remix will look for a function called a meta inside of your component, and if you don't name it meta and if you don't export it, then Remix won't find it. So if you want to imply, for example, the metadata for your component, you have to export it and call it meta. Now, this meta function over here, again, is just a type, right? Because we're working on TypeScript. But this is essential. And when you export your component, it is essential as well, because you're not actually going to import it and put it like you would in normal React or DOM. Remix will find it for you. Now, there's a bunch of like CSS, a bunch of our Tailwind, there's a bunch of stuff over here, and a bunch of resources that are not related to our project. It's just for this specific page, so I'll delete everything over here. I'll also delete all of these things over here because we're not going to be using them in our project. I'll just add a div as the default thing. Now let's start by building the structure for our project. What we want to build as an example in this course or this tutorial is a very simple login and logout functionality, where we're going to have two routes, one for the profile of a user and the other one for the login of a user. And you'll have abilities to persistently live logged in until you log out or delete your user. Now, all of that will be simulated through, we're not going to be making actual API requests, but I'll explain exactly where you would put an API request throughout the way. In this video, we're going to be using a mock database as an example, but it will be quite understandable as we go through what you would do if you were actually fetching data from a real API. Now, to start building that, we'll have over here our login page, which will exist inside of this div, which will then put another div inside of it. And this div specifically will contain an h1 tag that will basically just say login as the page title. Then we'll have a form, which is a component that we can actually import from remix run/react. And this form is the basis of having actions inside of Remix. So always use this component when you're creating a form that you want to submit data. Now we want to put over here the method for this form, which would be a post. And inside of here, we'll structure our form as following. We'll have a div, which will inside of it have a label. This label will have a name to it. In this case, we want to create a simple login page where a user has to put their name, their email, and their password. So the first label would just be name. And for each label, we have to add a HTML4 property that is going to link this label to its input, and we'll call it name. And then we just have to put the input over here. So I'll put input, and for the input type, we'll put text, and we'll put a name to it. It has to be the same, like whatever we want actually, but it will be name, and the ID has to be the same as this HTML4. So I'll put name over here, and we perfectly created the first element in our form, as you can see. Now let's copy this and paste it 2 more times. One will be for email, and we'll just again switch all of this and switch this to email. Now this type over here will also be email because it will force us to input an email. And then this will be for password. Let me just actually change this, password. And this will be password. And again, we'll just put password for all of this. Perfect. Now the last div that we want to put will actually not be a div, it will just be a button, will be the login button that will submit the information. So we'll put a type submit over here, and we pretty much finished the form. Now it looks really ugly and I want to make it look better. So I'm going to copy all of the Tailwind CSS that I already wrote, which if you are not familiar with Tailwind, you don't add CSS on a CSS file. You directly add your CSS by adding class names that are predetermined by Tailwind. So I already have all those CSS class names, so I'll just paste them over here, and you can copy if you want to for each of them. Perfect. As you can see, I just pasted all of the class names. Now it does look like a complete mess, but it is exactly the same structure as we had before. The difference is there's a bunch of class names, as you can see over here, and they basically just form what you see on the screen over here, which is a very simple form type website, which we can put a name like Pedro, an email like pedro@gmail.com, and a password like password, and then we can submit a form. But again, this we haven't set that up yet, so it's giving us an error, as you can see. So let's start working on the more technical side of everything. When you log in, we want to basically simulate adding some sort of data to a database, right? We don't have that database, but we're going to create a mock database that is going to be used as an example in this tutorial. To do that, we're going to create a users.ts file, and inside of here, we're going to have a lot of things that are going to be related to this user database. If you want to just copy this file, you can do that as well. But the most important thing is we're going to have an interface for how a user is going to look like. Now, a user will have what we already know, which is an ID, which is going to be a string, then a name, which is going to be a string, email, which again is going to be a string, and differently from the other ones, obviously not. We're going to have a password, which is also going to be a string. So we created this interface that is going to be representing a user. Now, what we want to do is create a database that is going to store items of this type. Let's call it users list, just users actually. And we'll say it will be a user list. Now, we're going to pre-populate this array as if our database was already made. So I just pasted over here all of the users that I have previously made as an example, and we're going to be building up this database through our project. So now what we want to do is create the functions that are going to interact with this database. Now imagine these functions being, for example, your database operations actually. So where you would put operations that would connect you and mutate and alter your database. Now we want to have a couple of them. We want to have first and foremost, we want to have a login user function. This function is going to have, in our case, it's going to require a user as the actual parameter that we're going to need to generate this function. Then we want to create a couple other. We want to create a find user function that is going to require an ID to find a specific user. We're going to need a find user by email and password, which is going to require an email and a password. And a password, okay, string. And we're going to need a delete user. So we're going to need a delete user function, which will also require an ID. Now, I premeditated, created all these functions, but obviously we're going to be generating them and writing the logic as we need them. We're not going to need all of them at once, but they are all the ones that we're going to need to implement the logic in this project. Now let's start with the login user because it's the one that we need right now. First thing in this function is we need to look for an existing user. We're going to just grab any existing user that might exist inside of the user's database, as if we were actually working with a database. We would look for if this user who's trying to log in already exists in it, because if it does, then we want to do specific things, and if it doesn't, we want to do other things. So in this case, the way we're going to find if an existing user exists as you're trying to log in is we're literally just going to look by using the find function, look through the database to find if there's any users with an email equal to the email passed in and trying to log in from the user, and they also have the same password. So we'll also check to see if the two information are the same as well. So password and password. So whenever a user calls this function over here, they try to log in and call this function, whatever information they pass in, we're going to put as the user over here, and we're basically just going to check to see if there's already an existing user with those same pieces of information. Then we're going to check to see if there's no existing user, then we want to basically create a new user in this mock database. We're going to say users.push, and we're going to push the new user. If there is a user already, then we're not going to do anything, and you'll see why when we actually call this function. So where are we going to call this login function? Let's go to our index.tsx. If you recall, whenever we click on the login function, it says method not allowed. The reason for that is because we're not telling Remix what to do whenever this form is submitted. So how do we do that? Well, in the case of the idea between server and client components, you can act in regards to the comparison between a server and a client component. In Remix, you can write server code inside two functions that will exist in almost every single one of your routes, which is the loader and the action function. You can write server code inside of both of them, allowing you to load data and also mutate data. So for example, and if I want to do something with this form, so like submit any data that is submitted through this form, I can create what is known as an action. And an action in Remix handle form submissions and other mutable operations like creating or updating data. And it is all server side. it receives an HTTP request data like you would from submitting a form, and it works seamlessly with the form component that we have over here. Whenever you submit a form in a component or a page, you'll have to create this function called action. And it is an async function that will take inside of it an object. It will get here the data from the form. Now we can actually destructure this by grabbing the request from here, and I'll just, as for TypeScript's sake, I'll define this object like this. It is actually a request from an HTTP request, and this type over here we can import on the top if we want to. Actually, it doesn't even need to be imported. But yeah, inside of here, we can specifically get the form data that is submitted from this index component by saying const form data is equal to await request dot form data. And then we'll get that information over here. So you'll see now that if I console log this form data, you should see actually something extremely cool. Let's try this out. I don't know why the CSS keeps failing on me, but let's open the console and write Pedro at gmail.com, and I'll just write password as the password. You might think that when I log in, it will console log something here, right? But guess what? It doesn't. It not only breaks the app because we haven't finished the action, but it also doesn't console log here. So where did it console log? Well, remember what I said. The action and the loader functions, which obviously we haven't created yet, but the action function specifically doesn't run on the client. It runs on the server. So technically, if I open this up and go a little bit back before it all broke, we should see the form data being console logged in our terminal because this is data that is running on the server. And then obviously it broke because we haven't finished the function. But this means that inside of here, you can't do things like accessing the window or the local storage or stuff like that that only exists in the browser. This is only the server. Now that that is out of the way, let's continue generating information based on our form data. So we have here this form data object, but how do I get the specific pieces of data inside of this form data? Well, if I want to get the name, I just say const name is equal to form data.get, and then and then I just put the name over here. And since I'm using TypeScript, I'll just converge this into a string, and this should get us the name. Now I'll do the same for the other ones. I'll do an email, I'll do a password, and I'll say email, and I'll say password. Perfect. All of them will be strings. Okay, let me go back. Now we're basically, this would be the part where you would basically write your API request if you weren't dealing with a fake API like I'm doing here. So let's check first to see if there's no email or no password, because if that's the case, we want to do some minor error handling. We'll return back over here from this API request a response.json that will say that there was an error saying email and password are required, something like that. And we can also pass in a status, which actually we pass over here. Status is equal to, I don't know, like 400. Okay, so we just passed in a status and an error, and we handled the error in that case. Now what we want to do is we want to create a new user object, which will represent the new user that we are creating in case that we are actually creating them. We'll create an object that will have an ID, a name, an email, and a password. Now, for the ID, how are we going to generate IDs for our users? Well, we're going to be using UUID, which is almost the most default version ID generator in the market. To use it, I'm going to actually just npm install UUID. And I also do need to install its types. So I'll also run npm install at types/UUID, something like that. Perfect. And we installed the package over here at the top. We'll import the v4 as UUID v4 from UUID. And whenever we want to generate an ID, we literally just use the UUID v4 function and it will generate one. Perfect. Now let's think a bit about how we're going to do this. We created a new user object over here, but this login function that we have over here, it both logs in a new user and creates them, but it also logs in an existing one, right? So we also want that whenever you log in, it will redirect you to a profile page. How do we do this? Well, I want to find a user based on their email and password. And the reason for that is because when you're when you're typing the info in the form, you obviously won't type in the ID. So we can't just find them by ID. We need to find it by username and password. Thankfully, we already have that logic over here. So we can technically just copy this, come over here, write this, and oh, I copied the wrong thing. I should have copied just this over here, and we'll paste it over here. And then we just copy this. Actually, we just delete the user dot and put it over here, which also means that if we can replace all of this logic that we wrote over here by find user by email and password, and then just pass in the user.email and the user.password over here as well. Okay, so now we have this function that we exported so we can actually access them over here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create an existing user variable and set it equal to find user by email and password, pass in the email and password from the form. And if that's the case, if there is an existing user, then we don't want to do anything. We actually just want to log in. But if there isn't, we want to create a user, right? That's the whole logic that we want behind this. Now, how are we going to do that? Actually, I might change the name of this function to add user. And the reason for that is because it's more of that, actually. You're not logging in over here. You're more of just adding them. So the whole portion where we detect if the user is logged in and log in will come over here. We'll create a unified user object, which will be either an existing object, an existing user one, or a new one. So new user. And no matter which one it is, we will return in the end a JSON message of success with that user and a status of 200, which we'll then use in our client logic. Now, in between this, we want to detect to see if the user is not an existing user, because if it isn't, then we add them into our database. So if it isn't, we'll then add user, that function that we had, and we'll pass in the user. So you understand what I did here, right? I first destructured all of the form data. I checked to see if there was any situation in which they forgot to add an email and a password. Then I created this new object called new user, just in case the user that is trying to log in isn't already a user in our database. Then we checked to see if there was a user with the same email and password in our database, and we created this variable called user, which is the mix between an existing user or a new user. It doesn't matter which one it is, because we do a check over here to see if that user does exist, and if it doesn't, then we create it. But no matter what, we return and log in. This logic over here is the login logic, because when you return a response from your action function on Remix, you can use a hook called use action data, which will allow us to grab this information inside of our client side. So I'll say use action data, and I'll import the hook. I think it auto imported. Now, since we're using TypeScript, we need to define the type for this action data. If you look over here, what is the type? Well, we have some error messages, and we also have the user. So over here at the top, we'll create a type. Actually, I'll do it over here. Let's create a type called action data, and we'll set it equal to a type with an error, which will be a string. And we'll also pass in a user, which will be, we'll have an ID. Actually, we already have this. It's just the user object, right? Or the user interface that we created. Perfect. Now we can check to see if this is working. I'll open up over here our network tab. I'll write Pedro. I'll put an email, pedro@gmail.com. I'll put a password and I'll click login. You see that there was indeed a fetch when we clicked that information. Now this is the information that was passed in. It includes our form data, it includes our password, it includes everything. Now, what has been done over here? Absolutely nothing. We just submitted that information. Technically, it since the Pedro user wasn't in the database, it does exist inside of this, obviously in the memory of our application, not in the actual code. But there's no way of checking it, and we aren't actually logged in. So how are we gonna check this? Well, whenever we log in, we want to be redirected to a profile page, which is going to display the information of the user who is logged in. And this is where we learn about routes in Remix, because how you create a route in Remix is pretty interesting. If I want to create a profile route, I can just come over here and click on new file and then put profile.tsx. Then inside of here, I can just export a component called profile. And technically, if I return whatever I return, if I return an h1 tag saying profile, this indeed works. I can come over here and go to the profile page, and it gave us an error because it doesn't have a loader. Now, the reason why we got this error message is because we don't have a loader function in our profile route. And the reason for that is because, and why it is an issue, is because we're making a GET request to the profile page, but we don't have a loader. This means that we do need to tell Remix a way for us to load this information and which data is going to help create this file. Now, one thing that is important is in this specific project, we want to have dynamic routes. So if you've ever worked with any routing system before, you probably know what it is. It's a route that has parameters to them. For example, we don't want to just go to localhost/profile. We want to go to localhost/ a number or an ID or whatever, because that is going to be the ID of the user whose profile we're trying to access. And then our page is going to dynamically change its UI based on which ID it is. So how are we going to do that? Well, first thing is in Remix, when you want to define a dynamic route, what you do is you write the name of the route, so /profile, as you can see over here, and then you put the param with a money sign right next to it. So in our case, the parameter will be the user ID, or in our case, let's just call it ID, meaning that now if we want to access the user, there's no, like, you'd have to access the profile / some sort of ID, right? The normal profile it shows a 404 not found because there's no route, which is just a profile route. Now we have to actually create a route that is gonna have this format over here. Now, how do we get rid of this loader error message and actually show this page? Well, we have to create our loader. So like I said, the loader, similar to the action, will be a function that is gonna run in the server. And the loader, in our case, will fetch the data from our params, and it will grab the user's data based on that ID. So I need to make this async, and over here we'll have the params of this route, which, let's just define a type. It will be params, and then it will be ID, which will be a string. Okay, then over here we want to console log as an initial example if the thing is correctly grabbing the params. So we'll just console log the params. Let's test this out and see if it's working. Again, this runs on the server, so we look at the console from here, not there. Let's refresh this, and it should have a, yeah. So the params is correctly being gathered, right? But obviously there's still more errors because we're not returning anything from this loader function. Now, what do we want to do inside of here? Well, we have access to the ID of the user for this profile. So now we want to fetch that user by using the find user function that we created in our API, this over here. Now we haven't actually made it. Its logic is actually pretty simple. All we do is we say users.find, and then we grab the users, and we literally just find the user with the ID equal to the ID that we pass into the function and return that user. Then over here, we'll pass in the params.id and get that user. Then if there's no user, we want to return a redirect back to the home page. So if I'm trying to get into a page which doesn't have a user with that specific ID, we just want to be redirected. Now, you might notice that I use the redirect function. This is a function that exists only in the server parts of this application. When we're dealing with the client side, so for example, if I want to navigate and redirect to another page based on a button click, then it will probably, what I will use is not this redirect function. It will be a function from React called navigate. It's part of a hook. We'll get to it. But this, keep in mind, is when you're dealing with redirects based on actions and loading of data. Then what I want to do down here is I want to return the success case, which will be a new response.json. And inside of here, I want to turn this user into a stringified version of it to return as data for our component. So I'll say json.stringify user. Don't worry that you're stringifying this object because it will be readable when we get it inside of this profile component. Then over here, I do want to pass the headers back from this request. Just as a simple example, I'll just pass in the classic content type, and we'll explain that this is going to be passed in as an application/JSON. Perfect. Now we're getting error because, oh yeah, this should be a response, not a response.json. I apologize. Now we're pretty much done with the loading part. And I hope you understood what the loading is, what the purpose of it is. It's for loading data that is going to be used in our component. Now that's all cool, but how do we get that data? Well, the way you get it is by using the use loader data hook, which doesn't require anything over here, but it requires a type because we know the type of what this is going to return. It is going to return a user type, so we can just put over here user and then save it and also import it over here at the top. Now we should get back whatever data we get from this. Now let's build the UI for this component. You should see that now that we have everything pretty much done. Why does it say export, transform failed, unexpected export? Oh yeah, let's actually, sorry, let's export this function with the default function, the default notation. So we'll say, we'll save this. We'll actually remove this export over here. We'll just create the const profile. And then at the bottom, we'll say export default profile. And now it should work. If we go to like profile, yeah, let's go to this profile over here. Oh, it redirects us back. Let's actually go to a profile of a user we know exists. Like John Doe. Let's go to profile/1. Profile/1. You see, now we don't get that error. We actually get a profile UI that we wrote over here. But let's write the actual UI for this page. Let's put a div over here. And let's, inside of this, put another div and put an h1 tag that will say welcome, and then we'll access the name of the user we're trying to welcome. Now, how do we access that? Well, we already have that data. We have the user object over here, so we'll say user.name. Perfect. Now we'll come down here, we'll put a p tag, which will say the email of the user, which will be user.email. Then down here, we'll pass in a div, which will include the information for logging out and deleting an account. Now, we don't want to do that right now. We'll do that in a second, but you should see that the information from the user based on the param is correctly being displayed. And it's already working perfectly, right? If we were, for example, to come back here and create a new account, right? Let's say Pedro, and then pedro@gmail.com. And then let's put the password, and we click login. Oh yeah, we haven't redirected after login. So we'll do that in a second. But what we want to happen is it will redirect us to a page that will show us the information for Pedro. So we'll do that right now. We'll come back to this profile page and put the Tailwind CSS to make it look semi-okay. But we'll do that because that's more urgent. We'll come to our index.tsx over here. And we want such that whenever we do this over here, we get redirected to the new page. Now, we technically could just redirect inside of here. We could redirect inside of here on this return and just redirect our user. But there's one thing I want to do in this application, which is make it such that when you log in, information is stored in the local storage so that it persists as you re-render your page and you move to new tabs and everything. So I want to continue logged in even though I change tabs, you know? And if you're familiar with the local storage, which I believe you should be if you're watching this tutorial, it is something that exists on the client, so on the browser. So that means that I can't call and set the local storage items inside of this action function. I need to do it inside of my index component. So what all of this means is that I need to find a way to redirect after a user has been created, but without being inside of this action function. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to be using, and this is how Remix recommends us doing this, is we're going to be using, first of all, the use navigate hook, which is from React DOM, to redirect by using the navigate function. So we'll say navigate equals to use navigate. And this will allow us to actually redirect whenever we want to. Then I'm going to create a use effect that is going to be called a couple of times whenever both the action data changes and whenever the navigate function changes. So we'll put both of them as dependencies to this use effect. And whenever the user submits the form, then the action data will change because we'll return over here the user that was created or the user that was logged in on the response, meaning that this use effect will be called, meaning that inside of here, I can check to see, okay, if the action data changed and it actually has a user, right? And the user is not null, then I know that they logged in or were created. So what I want to do is, why does it say it doesn't? Oh yeah, we probably want to create an action. Oh, we created the action data type over here, but we never actually passed it. That's crazy. I hope you caught that and did that, but yeah, action data. So we'll say if action data.user exists, then I want to, first of all, set an item on the local storage. We'll set it user logged in, or user logged actually to make it simple. And we'll pass in their information stringified into the local storage. So we'll pass in the action data dot user over here. And not only that, but we'll also navigate to the /profile/ whatever their ID is. So we'll navigate to the action data.user.id to see the specific user's profile. Now, what does this mean? It means that now, if I come over here and I say, I want to log into Pedro's account on pedro@gmail.com, and then on the password that I'll just call password, then I'll click login, and it actually takes me to the specific profile of this user. But not only that, it also saves that information on the browser. Now you see I have two things over here, is because I already I was working on this project before, right, to make this video, and it was already there. But this is the one we just created, right? For Pedro, it has this ID, and this is in our local storage. No matter how many times we refresh this will be saved over here, and it will persist as we go through our application. Now, you see this ID, right? The problem is that if I go over here and I go to, I'm logged in, but if I go back to the login page, it will still show me the login page. So I want to make one final adjustment over here, which is on this use effect. I want to also check to see if the user is already logged in. And the way I'm going to do that is by getting the local storage items and checking to see if the user is already there. So we'll say const stored user window or actually let's just say local storage dot get item, and we'll pass in the user logged item. Then I'll say if a stored user is true, it means that they exist. It means that there is a user in the local storage. It means that we already logged in, so we just parse that information. So we'll say const user equals to json.parse, and we'll grab the stored user, and then what we can do is just navigate. Now, since this runs at a stage where it will be the first render, I've found that it has some problems if you use the navigate function to do this. It will cause some problems with Remix. So I researched more about this because I had never run into a situation where this would cause problems. And for this specific tutorial, I found a solution through the Remix documentation, which is in situations like this, you can bypass the navigate system by just changing the location.path name on your URL to something else. So we'll do the exact same thing over here. Instead of navigating, we'll just change our location to profile / and then we'll do this, and we'll navigate to user.id. Perfect. You saw that already my background changed. I'm already on this page. And when I try to go back to the login page, it redirects me back to my profile page until I come over here and I delete this item from my local storage, and then I'll actually be able to log in again. Perfect. Now let's log in one more time, just so we can actually add the styling to the profile page. So I'll put password and I'll click login. And for the profile page, I'll just paste this over here, which will be the class name. As you can see, it makes our UI look better, but also it allows us to start writing the functionality to delete your account and actually log out from your account. Now to do that, we're gonna have to come over here and add another form, another remix form inside of this. Again, we'll have the same method of post, and it will have only an input, which will be of type hidden, and it will be of the name action, and the value will be logout. Now we'll also add a button right next to it, which actually, let me just button, and it will just say logout. And over here, we'll put a type of submit into it. We'll do the exact same thing, but for the delete user. So we'll come over here and we'll put the delete user, we'll say value, delete. We'll keep the other ones the same, and then I'll put delete account. Perfect. I want to emphasize more and more, and that's why I created this two different things you might want to do. I want to emphasize more and more how Remix is structured and the whole idea of having client and server components in your application. Because if you think about it, both the logout and the delete functionality have different purposes depending if you're talking about what is going to happen on the client side and what is going to happen on the server side. On the client side, for example, no matter which function is being called, you want to do one thing and one thing only, which is to remove the local storage item from your storage. So what we can do is, on both of these forms, we can have an unsubmit, which is going to call this function that we can create over here on the top. It's going to be called handle client side logout. And it's going to take in an action. So if it's either a delete action or a logout action, so there's two things over here that we put. And inside of here, we can just check if the action is equal to logout, or if the action is equal to delete. Obviously, this is kind of redundant because those are the only two options, but I want to emphasize that this is where we will put this kind of logic. We will just local storage dot remove item, and we'll remove the user logged item. Now, again, this is all we want to do in the front end. Literally all we want to do in the front end. And we'll call this handle client's logout over here. So since we're passing in some argument to it, we have to create an inline function, and we'll pass in, this case is the logout. So we'll put logout, and the other one, let's just copy this as well, will be the delete one. So we'll say delete. Now, this should work in the front end. It's hidden over here because we haven't put any CSS to it. We'll do this right now so we can see it. I'll just come here and I'll copy my Tailwind. Again, if you want to copy, you can do that. Okay, just pasted my Tailwind. It's a bunch of strings, as you can see, but now we can see both of them. Now, if we click on them, all that's going to happen, no matter which one, is we're going to delete the item, right? So I'll come over here and you'll see, if we click on one of them, that thing will disappear. Now, it says method not allowed, actually, before I move out. It says method not allowed because we also haven't handled this action on the backend. Now, the backend action, what it's going to do is we want to be able to, if it is a logout, we just want to be able to redirect back to the home page. But if it is a delete, then we want to actually delete this user from the database. So I'm going to log in again to the Pedro account, and I want to come over here on the top. And remember what I said, if you want to handle the actions from a component in Remix, you have to create the action function. So we'll say export const action. We'll make it again async. And we'll pass in over here an argument to this function. And this function will take in two things. Actually, we'll just take in, as of right now, the params, and we'll put an example, a type for this. Params will be equal to ID, which will be equal to string, similar to how we did for the loader, right? Then inside of here, we want to also be able to get the request. And the request by itself, we don't have to define the type, although we can actually. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll also define the request over here. And the request, obviously, its type is just request. Now, inside of here, we want to grab the form data. So I'm going to say form data is equal to await request dot form data, like we did before. Then we want to specify what action type it is based on how we defined our forms, right? Remember, we set an action and a value to each input, and that's why we created the inputs, so that for each form we actually have something to recognize it. So over here we'll say action type is equal to form data dot get, and then we'll get the action from it. Perfect. Now let's handle both types. Let's first handle, what if the action type is equal to logout? We know that in the client side, all we do is remove the local storage item. But here, all we do is we return a redirect to our home page, or the login page. Now, what will happen if the action type is a delete? Well, not only will we also redirect to the home page, but we also want to call the delete user function and pass in the params.id that we get over here on the top. Now, we haven't made that delete user function, so we'll make it over here. It's actually pretty simple. If you've never worked with just normal JavaScript like we're doing over here, delete functionality is one of the a bit harder ones, but there's a couple ways of doing this. The way I like to do is I'll just say const index, so we can get the index for the user with a specific ID. Then we'll say users.find index. We'll grab the user and we'll find the index of the user with the ID equal to the ID. And now that we have the index of where this user is in the database, we'll just say if the index that we found is not equal to -1, just so we handle this case. Then we want to say users.splice, and we'll splice between the index and 1, meaning we'll remove that user from the database. So now it should work. I'll log in again as Pedro, then pedro@gmail.com. Then I'll put the same password. We'll log in. You can have this account. You see this ID, right? If I were to delete this account, and I were to then log into the same Pedro account, so gmail.com, now what happens is the ID over here is different, meaning that we had to generate a new account even though it has the same information. So this is basically it for most of the code. Now, if you've seen other tutorials on this topic in the past, you might be thinking that I didn't really explain. Now, if you've seen tutorials or even the documentation for Remix, you might think that you haven't learned a lot about Remix. There's a bunch of different difficult things that you still have to learn. But what I beg you to understand is something that it was hard for me to understand when I was learning it, is the fact that whenever you learn a new technology, a new framework specifically, may it be Remix, may it be something like Next.js, understanding that it isn't that different from what you already know is the most important step, because Remix is not that different from just normal React without using Remix. It has a lot of things that are beneficial, a lot of things that can help you in the long run, but it is not that different. I explained to you guys the core concepts, which is the difference between the client code and the server code, what you need to know about routing, all the routes go over here, but I focused on showing you guys that you can build a normal application like you would in React by implementing the necessary standards that Remix impose. For example, every component, every route that you write will have to have an action function and a loader function if you want to mutate and fetch data. Now, I obviously didn't use an API for this. I think the logic that I used was a little bit more simple, but at the same time, I feel like it could perceive the information further this way. So we have over here a really nice example of a simple CRUD without the update functionality, just to not make the video too long. And I hope you guys were able to learn a lot from this. If you're interested in the code will be in the description. If you want to see more Remix videos, I can make more Remix videos. I can make an actual full stack, like making the database and everything. If you guys want that, I can definitely do that. Really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting twice a week, no exceptions. Comment down below any questions. I will answer as many as I can. And yeah, that's basically it. Really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.